our Monday webinars. You'll see that my background has changed. I'm actually in my office at JTS, which feels momentous, and also all my computer settings are different. So it's an adventure today. Okay, so but moving on. If anyone who's joining us for the first time today for a webinar, we're very pleased to have you. Our topic for today, Rabbi Tucker's topic for today, is atonement and interplay between the individual and the community. And we will introduce him at a little more length in a few minutes. I wanted to just really thank our sponsors for today's webinar, Sandy Starkman and Larry Pachter, who have sponsored at the Navi level. That's our highest sponsorship level in honor of their parents of blessed memory. Mildred Lashinsky Starkman, Sydney L. Starkman, and Sydney and Sylvia Pachter. Sandy and Larry, you're such great friends of JTS, and we're honored that you sponsored this webinar in memory of your parents. So thank you so much. And everyone else, I want to make sure you know that if you're inspired by this wonderful opportunity to learn with JTS faculty, we would love for you to sponsor a session as well. We have 3 levels, Chacham for $540, Sadiq for $1,000, and Navi for $1,800. And if you want to learn more, you can email learninglives@jtsa.edu. And one last thing before we go ahead with today's session, I want to make sure everyone knows about our new fall series, which I'm so excited about. So we will be starting Mondays, our usual 2 o'clock Eastern time, starting October 4th, right after the holidays are done. The series is called 6 Days Shall You Labor, Perspectives on Work in Jewish Texts and Tradition. And this series, like all of the webinar series we've done, it has a uniting theme, and yet is really far-ranging. And you'll hear from a huge breadth of JTS faculty. We talking about what is the meaning of work versus rest. Of course, that's a central part of Jewish tradition. We'll be talking about certain professions that Jews have been drawn into for a whole range of reasons: geography, economy, gender. Over the course of our history, Jewish labor movements. All kinds of really interesting stuff from throughout Jewish tradition and Jewish history and Jewish thought. So we really hope that you'll join us starting October 4th, and Professor David Kramer will be kicking us off that day. All right, so on that note, I will turn it over to Tani Schwartz-Herman, who coordinates this series, to give us a bit more guidance.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to go over the Q&A for today, Rabbi Tucker will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We'll also have a Q&A period at the end. You can use your chat feature to submit your question to Rabbi Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few questions to present to Rabbi Tucker. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with myself or Lynn Feynman. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link for the session this morning. I'm so pleased now to introduce Rabbi Tucker. As Vice Chancellor for Religious Life and Engagement, Rabbi Gordon Tucker focuses on enhancing Jewish life at JTS. Rabbi Tucker previously served as Dean of JTS's Rabbinical School and as Assistant Professor of Jewish Thought at JTS. Most recently, Rabbi Tucker served as Senior Rabbi at Temple Israel Center in White Plains, New York. Rabbi Tucker is the author of scores of articles on Jewish theology and law. In addition, he published Heavenly Torah, a translation of and commentary on Abraham Joshua Heschel's 3-volume work on rabbinic theology, as well as a commentary on Pirkei Avot. An anthology of Rabbi Tucker's writings was published in 2014 under the title Torah for Its Intended Purpose. Now going to go ahead and turn it over to Rabbi Tucker.
Okay, thank you, Tani and Rabbi Andelman. It's good to have you all with us today, and wishing everybody a good and a sweet new year. I am going to begin with a bracha, not saying the bracha, but reading about the bracha. It's a bracha that's not very well known. It appears in the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Brachot, and it's really the first text that we have, which I am now going to put up on screen share. So here is that first text. Our masters taught, if one sees massive numbers of the people Israel, Ochlosei Yisrael, one says, blessed is the one who knows all secrets. Baruch Chacham Harazim. For none of their thoughts are the same, nor are their physical appearances identical. I'm pretty confident that there are at least a few people on the screen here who have probably never heard of that bracha. During the 24 years that I served as a congregational rabbi, I had the impetus to say that quietly to myself every Leil Yom Kippur. So I looked out at the masses who congregate in the synagogue on that night, Kol Nidre night. And I said it because I had both the privilege and the burden of being entrusted with just a piece of the many secrets of all kinds that live within each of us. That there is a special moment in the year which de facto comes to be the moment of massive gathering. That's hardly confined to our community and our tradition. I'm going to tell you a quick story that will no doubt elicit a smile or at least a knowing nod. It was Christmas Eve, and I had just arrived in Arizona for a winter vacation week with extended family, something we do every year. But it was still Christmas Eve, and curiosity got the better of me as to what an Anglican priest would have to say to his congregation on that night. So it brought me to a church in Mesa, Arizona, to experience this as a visitor. The church was beautifully decked out. Greeters very graciously welcomed me. And I took what was almost the very last seat in the packed sanctuary. And after some liturgy that was accompanied by beautiful music, a young priest climbed the steps up to the pulpit and he prepared to preach. But before he did, he looked out at the filled room, he took it in, thought for a moment, after which he spoke the following words. He said to the congregation, you know, we do this every Sunday. And as you might imagine, I felt an immediate kinship with this colleague of another faith. And yet, this feature of Yom Kippur, everyone gathered there, when you might even have the impetus to say, you know, we do this every Shabbat. This feature of Yom Kippur is the result of a noteworthy reversal that perhaps unnoticed took place at some point in the history of our people. So to begin to see this, I want to consider our next text, which is again from the Talmud. This time it's from Tractate Psachim, 64b. Our masters taught, never was a person trampled in the temple courtyard at the time of the Pesach offering, except for 1 year, in the time of Hillel, when it happened to one elderly man, and that became known as the Pesach of trampling. Boy, that terrible, that poor elderly man. Here was a description, according to this text, the largest gathering of Jews was at the Passover. And this was true at least since the time of King Josiah in the 7th century BCE. And to see this, just look at the next text here, which comes from the second book of Kings. The king, this is King Josiah, commanded all the people, offer the Pesach sacrifice to the Lord your God as prescribed in this scroll of the covenant. This was a scroll that had been found in the temple and brought to the king, and he read it, and he said afterwards, we're going to do Pesach as this scroll tells us to do it. And now the Pesach sacrifice, we are told, had not been offered in that manner in the days of the chieftains who ruled Israel, the Shoftim, or during the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. Only in the 18th year of King Josiah was such a Pesach sacrifice offered in that manner to the Lord in Jerusalem. Apparently, following the dictate of the book of Deuteronomy recently found in the temple, the king transforms the paschal sacrifice, which had formerly been a family ritual performed at a local shrine. He transforms it into a national ritual performed at what was now the only legitimate shrine and the only legitimate altar. So it was Pesach that became the great national holiday. That was when you renewed your membership in the Jewish people. And you renewed your membership, as it were, by participating in this national rite at the nation's center. And this, I believe, was the true meaning of the threat that is made to people who neglect the paschal sacrifice. They are threatened with what is called karet, being cut off, whatever that means. But being cut off, I think the true meaning of that was, if you neglected the paschal sacrifice, you had simply and directly failed to renew your membership in the Jewish people. You were ipso facto cut off. Now, just how reliably entrenched this aspect of Passover was is attested to by the continuation of that text in Tractate Psachim. So let's go back to that and take a look at how the text continues. We're over here now. The sages taught, once King Agrippa wished to set his eyes on the multitudes, the uchlosin of Israel, that is, to take a census. So he said to the high priest, count up the paschal lambs. The high priest took a kidney from each one, and 600,000 pairs of kidneys were found there, double the number of those who left Egypt. And that excluded those who were ritually impure, who couldn't be part of the ritual, or at a great distance. And moreover, there was not a single paschal lamb that did not have more than 10 people registered for it. So you had to multiply that number not only by 2, right, because there were 2, double the number of those who left Egypt, but you had to multiply it again by 10. And they called that Pesach the Pesach of the crowded. That's a rather remarkable. In other words, if you wanted a sense of how many Jews there were, this was the moment that was determinative. That was when you could be sure all the Jews were there. Yom Kippur, which was aptly called by the late Professor Jacob Milgram, was called the Day of Purgation, the day in which the sanctuary was purged. In contrast, that was a day in which the people fasted in private support of the high priest. The high priest was preparing and cleansing the sanctuary to be worthy of the worship and service that was to take place 5 days hence at the fall pilgrimage of Sukkot. And yet, history has somehow conspired to make Pesach, as we know it today, into the private home holiday. And the days of awe are the days on which such large numbers come together that one feels the urge to say that obscure bracha about the one who is wise to all secrets. Indeed, in terms of renewing membership, which used to be the function of the Pesach offering, just think about it. This is precisely the time of year in anticipation of Yom Kippur that the dues bills go out from every synagogue. This is when you renew your membership. And by the way, in contrast to King Agrippa's method of taking a census of the Jews by looking at how many were there for Passover, I was told years ago by Rabbi Wolf Kelman of blessed memory that it was once standard for Jewish communities across the country, when they wanted to estimate the number of Jews in their area, that they would extrapolate from the absentee rate in the public schools, not on Passover, but of course on Yom Kippur. If they knew how many were absent on Yom Kippur, they had a pretty good handle of how many Jews, or at least Jewish households, there were in the community. So such has been the reversal. Pesach becomes Yom Kippur becomes Pesach. That's not necessarily good or bad, but it's noteworthy. And at that moment of Yom Kippur, and boy, is that true this year, there's a need to be with others. For those for whom that's possible. Certainly in normal times, you can sense that. As people see one another again, are reassured that all is well, even as they notice and mourn the absence of those here and there who are no longer present. You even see it in the ways in which people express their seating preferences for the holidays, because whom they are surrounded by is somehow deeply significant and important to them. And yet, the individual aspect of Yom Kippur, the day of fasting and introspection for each unique soul, that was not eradicated and could not be eradicated by the communal role that was assumed by the Day of Atonement. And so the word atonement, the actual etymology of which is at-one-ment, that's the actual etymology. That word already raises the question of with what or with whom are we seeking to be at one? Is it the true individual self that we are trying to touch and to encounter, sometimes confront? Or is it the community of Israel with whom we yearn to be connected? Or the community of all of humanity? And in truth, I think it is an intricate interplay of both. So how this plays out in the liturgy of the day, and how that liturgy gets experienced can be illustrated, I think, by focusing on two of the signature prayers. One of them was actually originally a Rosh Hashanah prayer that got extended into Yom Kippur. Of course, that's Unetaneh Tokef. And the other is the Yom Kippur Confession. And what I'm going to argue is that each of these partake of both the individual and the community. But as we will see, there's a reason to see each of them as pulling in a different direction. That is, Unetaneh Tokef may become much more powerful as understood as a communal prayer, and the confession may be much more important when seen as an individual prayer. So we're going to turn to all of these in a moment, but this would be an opportune time. I don't know how much has been raised in ways of questions or reflections right now, but we'll take a brief pause of up to a maximum of 5 minutes to take any questions or comments that there may be right now, maybe reflections that people have on some of their own experiences of Yom Kippur and the many crowds, but we'll give an opportunity for that in the next few moments.
We don't have much in yet, but so, okay, well, this is an interesting question that just popped in. So sorry about that. Someone asked, what about at-one-ment, to be at one with God?
Yes, well, that's particularly good since God is also the one, right? Adonai Echad. So yes, that's of course another possibility. It's not just with the self or with the community, but it could certainly be at one with God. Although being at one with God itself raises some interesting theological questions as to whether that's really possible for the finite and the infinite to somehow merge. But yes, absolutely. Certainly from the point of view of mystics, that would be a very important aspiration.
For those who joined late, just so you know, the way we are handling Q&A is you send your questions to me. We spare the faculty the onslaught of the chat. Okay, and someone has asked, what about the importance of Sukkot attendance? Where does that fit into the framework that you've shared with us?
Yeah, so Sukkot was also a time of massive gathering for a somewhat different reason. If if one wanted to use the word high holidays, which there are a few people here I see on the screen from Temple Israel Center, so they know I kind of worked to ban that term some years ago because there's no Hebrew translation of that term. That's not a Hebrew term. We call it Yamim HaNoraim, the days of awe. But if one were to talk about a high holiday in ancient times, the high holiday would be Sukkot. That's when everyone was streaming into the sanctuary, and for good reason. It was the time of Thanksgiving for the harvest of the year. It was the time when the backbreaking work of the farmer was finally done, and one could take the family and go on a week's vacation to the sanctuary and be there in celebration. So yes, there were large numbers of people there, but it wasn't quite the same as Pesach, whereas I noted not showing up for Sukkot was to miss a kind of an opportunity to be together in that way. Not to show up on Pesach was to really commit an infraction. It was to cut yourself off from the people. And that's why I think when that story about King Agrippa, he knew that people were going to be especially careful to be there on Pesach, the same way people are especially careful to be in Shul on Yom Kippur nowadays.
Okay, just one more question that someone asked, just really on the point you just made. Is that really the case that everyone made it? I think we have a month later Pesach Sheni for people who couldn't make it the first time, and surely there were people who, who were sick or something like that, who couldn't make it, and then it seems like an unreliable way of taking a census of the people. How inclusive was this? Everyone is there.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, you have to take some of these stories with a little bit of a grain of salt. The point of the story, of course, is not so much to tell you what was in King Agrippa's mind or what the results of the census were. The point of the story really is to tell you how massive was the gathering at Pesach. And of course, it's a shocking idea that Jews at any point in history would have failed to, live up to all of their obligations. It's hard to believe that Jews would ever do anything like that. But of course, there were accidents. People had suffered a death in the family and had become ritually impure by burying the dead. And that was already taken account of in the story itself. It didn't include all of those people, so you had to even add a certain amount to what you got. But it hardly matters how many of the Jews may have fallen by the wayside in this obligation. The point of the story is that everyone knew that was a time when masses were going to be gathering. Okay, so we're going to move on. There really is very little need to. By the way, I apologize. I'm in my office at JTS also, but I have the subway noise right behind me. So occasionally, right now, you may be hearing it, but it passes. There's little need to rehearse the substance of the Unetaneh Tokef prayer, except to note that we're going to be focusing both on the evocation of judgment, Hine Yom Hadin, the judgment day is here, and the consequences of that judgment, which is in the well-known litany of the ills that may meet any one of us in the coming year. That is, who by fire and who by flood, which if you live in the West or in the East has a particular resonance this year, of course. Who by fire, who by flood, who by earthquake, who by plague. Talk about a resonance this year. So it'll be both that, the judgment and the consequences of the judgment, because how this prayer can be received by one for whom Yom Kippur is primarily a day of personal, individual self-examination, is maybe different from how it is received when Yom Kippur is approached as a communal event. And to begin to see this, we're going to turn to the next text. This text comes from Rabbi Harold Schulweis of blessed memory, his book, For Those Who Can't Believe. And it contains a letter that Rabbi Schulweis actually received after one particular Rosh Hashanah. I mentioned that Unetaneh Tokef is also recited, of course, on Rosh Hashanah. He received this letter right after Rosh Hashanah from a congregant whose pseudonym in the book is Martha. And that's how we will know her here in referring to her. So let me put this up now. So she wrote, "Dear Rabbi, until this morning, I knew the central liturgy of the holiday well. But before this year, I had approached it in an abstract intellectual manner. This year, I could not do so. Several months ago, I had surgery for cancer. And I felt very keenly as I approached these days that in a real sense, my fate for the coming year has been written, if not in a book of judgment, then in my own body. I look forward to health, but I may not be granted it. And as I read, the questions of the service were familiar. How many shall pass away? How many shall be born? Who shall live? Who shall die? But the response, repentance, prayer, and righteousness avert the severe decree, for the first time carried a terrifying implication. It seemed to me, as I read this, that my own liturgy was binding my fate to my behavior, that my illness seen in this light has been the result of some terrible unknown transgression, and that the ultimate punishment for failure to discover and correct it could be my death. I do not believe this, not with my head or with my heart. Nevertheless, as a committed Jew who takes language very seriously and believes in community prayer, I would be forced to repeat the central cornerstone over and over should I attend services for Yom Kippur. It seems today that my choice is a terrible one: to flagellate myself emotionally by joining my congregation, or to spare my feelings by isolating myself from my family, my friends, my community. It is a choice I never believed I would have to make. And I write with pain, hoping that from the expression of my dilemma will grow some insight, some way to cope." So I could, I suppose, take a poll, though I won't do it, but I could take a poll as to how many of us have ever felt about this prayer in any year, but maybe particularly this year, in the way Martha did that year. But now here's something fascinating in this letter. The conventional theology of suffering, that suffering is tightly correlated to sin, is in fact very difficult, as she points out, particularly when we stand it up beside all of the fairly obvious counterexamples in the world, all the calamities that befall good people. By the way, the reverse of that is also problematic. All the successes that befall horrible people. And still, how has that theology survived? It survived because it has had one very important appeal, at least to many who were suffering, that if it was their actions or inactions that had brought on their distress, then perhaps their actions could undo that distress as well. In other words, the otherwise very problematic theology gave many, not all, but gave many people a sense of control. And in that way, averted the special terror of randomness and of chance. And that's what's so fascinating in Martha's case as you read this letter. As a committed and practicing Jew, which is how she describes herself, she is somehow more able to deal with the idea of an arbitrary decree than with the assertion that it responds to what we do or don't do. Control is less important to her than it might otherwise be. She is, in a sense, like Job in the book of Job, because she knows the truth about herself, that she is not a bad person that has called forth a punishment of this disease. She knows the truth about herself and her disease, and she is not going to acquiesce in a worldview that this prayer was trying to foist on her. And as it was with Martha, so is Unetaneh Tokef. And I can tell you, 24 years as a congregational rabbi, I had conversations with many Marthas, so to speak, making Unetaneh Tokef a serious obstacle for those for whom Yom Kippur turns them inward as individual souls. It just becomes a real stumbling block in the way of faith. On the other hand, I think that there's some evidence that it need not be such an obstacle if and when the communal quality of Yom Kippur becomes the primary focus. And I'm going to give you a striking illustration of that. And I commend to you the next text, which I will presently put up. So it describes something that happened decades ago in a militantly secular kibbutz in the Beit Sha'an Valley, the kibbutz known as Beit Hashita. Something shattering happened to its members in 1973. On Yom Kippur, you'll remember, war broke out. And when the casualties were counted, Beit Hashita had the highest per capita losses of any town or village throughout all of Israel. 11 young men were killed from that one kibbutz. And that forever changed Yom Kippur in that bastion of secularity. It didn't change the secularity, mind you. Please understand that. But it changed Yom Kippur's place in that setting. And here is an account of this. It was given in the Israeli press years later by a journalist named Mati Friedman. I'm putting it up now. One day after the war's end, 11 small army trucks pulled through the kibbutz gates, headlights on, even though it was daytime. And it goes on to describe what I just described to you and how Yom Kippur on the kibbutz became a day of mourning for the men killed in the war. The grief was still raw 17 years later in 1990, when one of Israel's best-known songwriters, Yair Rosenblum, came to stay at the kibbutz. And as Yom Kippur approached, he decided to give something personal, something of himself to this special day. Flipping through a High Holidays prayer book, he came across Unetaneh Tokef. And it talks about how we don't know exactly where that prayer came from, but the text of the prayer could not have been farther from the kibbutz's militantly secular approach to Yom Kippur. Members had marked it as a day of meditation and honoring the dead that had nothing to do with a God whose non-existence they considered to be an article of faith. The article of faith was not to believe in God. So this Michal Shalev from the kibbutz said, Yair read it and he knew this was what he was looking for. He didn't shut his eyes all night. He waited for the morning for the house to be empty of people and for a chance to play uninterrupted. And when Shalev arrived at about 10 a.m., she found Rosenblum writing and crying. He played her a tune he had written for the prayer, a melding of European cantorial melodies, Sephardic tunes, and modern Israeli music. It was one of those moments in which you feel shaken and an excitement that has no room for words. It was sung at the end of the ceremony on the eve of Yom Kippur that year, 1990. Rosenblum had introduced an unapologetically religious text into a stronghold of secularism and touched the rawest nerve of the community, that of the Yom Kippur War. The result appears to have been overpowering. When Hanoch, that was the person, the Chazan who from the community, they got to sing it. When he began to sing and broke open the gates of heaven, the audience was struck dumb. Something special happened. It was like a shared religious experience that linked the experience of loss, which was especially present since the war. The words of the Jewish prayer that expressed man's nothingness compared to God's greatness, death to sanctify God's name and accepting judgment, and all of that connected to and linked to the melody, which included elements of prayer. So here you have the counterpart to Martha. Martha was the committed Jew for whom the prayer, read as she did as an individual, created for her a theological breaking point. For the secular Zionists of Beit HaShita, it wasn't a breaking point, it was a breaking open. For these secular Zionists, even as they spoke of the changed power of Yom Kippur, note that they made a point of saying that, of course, they would never think of fasting on that day. For them, nevertheless, it repaired something of an umbilical cord to a tradition that had nearly but not entirely been severed. For these detached secularists who prided themselves on being free and independent, this poem's unvarnished confrontation with the vicissitudes of life touched something in them. It had nothing to do with judgment. It had nothing to do with tying calamity to sin. What was touched in them was the fact of shared human suffering, and the suffering as Jews, of suffering as Zionists and Israelis. And it touched to them because of the sharing with other communities within the tradition from which they had alienated themselves. And it has endured to this day, because in just 3 or 4 days, Yair Rosenblum's composition will be sung there in 2021. By the way, as it is sung in a lot of synagogues around the world now. And it will move the community as a whole to greater solidarity in human and in Jewish vulnerability. So there you have my contention that Unetaneh Tokef can be extremely problematic, almost theologically toxic, if you are reading it as about individual responsibility, but it becomes deeply moving and solidifying when you read it as part of the Jewish people, or even I would say as part of humanity, all of whom are subject to these vicissitudes that the prayer enumerates. One of the things about the book of Psalms, I always wondered why people find such comfort in the book of Psalms, because if you read through the Psalms, there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of anger in there. And then it hit me one day that the reason that's comforting is because it teaches you that you're not alone. That suffering and anger at it, and feelings of wanting to lash out, people have felt this since time immemorial, and the species has survived, the people have survived, and even have written beautiful poetry about it. So something like that has happened here with Unetaneh Tokef, and probably tells us that the fact that so many people come together on Yom Kippur, maybe that was even part of the impetus for the creation of Unetaneh Tokef as part of our liturgy. So let's take our second brief pause here for questions or comments before we move on to the next and really final segment, where we will talk about the Yom Kippur confession. We'll see what we have perhaps in the chat.
So interestingly, I don't have so many questions in today, which I think with a lot of people on, I think that means people are really hanging on your every word. But I'll just share what you just taught us is so helpful to me, and kind of just gave me a new lens for my experience of Unetaneh Tokef the last couple of years. Last year when I led it, I was unexpectedly really emotionally overcome and had to pause, and everyone paused as I did because I was the one leading it. And that was about the pandemic, just saying just the reality of so many people having died since the previous Yom Kippur. And this year, as you know, my father passed away between last Yom Kippur and this Yom Kippur. And And I anticipated being emotionally overcome. And I actually had someone else on standby to take over if I needed them to, because I felt like that's my thing. That's not about, right? That's about me. That's not about the tzibur, about the community. And I did turn to that person to briefly take over, and it seems very consistent with what you just shared. That just really affirming Unetaneh Tokef as about connecting to loss as a community. And of course, each of us has experienced our own personal losses, but it's not sort of about any one of us. Is that
Yeah.
Does that sound consistent with what you said?
It gets back to what I said at the beginning. When I would silently say that bracha, Chacham Harazim, looking out at the crowds on Yom Kippur, you always thought, I always thought at least, the impossible, right? That is, it's impossible and not even good, right, for everyone to know everyone else's secrets. But if they just could for a split second, they would know how connected they are to one another, because everyone has those darknesses in their lives that they can't and won't and can't wear on their sleeves, but they're real when it's inside them. And if only people could know that they're not alone in that, it would be enormously solidifying. Yeah.
Someone has just added to your point that the person wrote, it seems that Unetaneh Tokef is both a prayer of humility and of hope, one that speaks to our own limitations, but at the same time, the message of Teshuva, Tefillah, Tzedakah, it's kind of a sign of hope against fatalistic hopelessness, as this person writes, and they're curious to know if you agree.
Yeah, I'll tell you an interesting thing about, Unetaneh Tokef goes on beyond the Teshuva and Tefillah and Tzedakah and talks about the ways in which we are fragile and vulnerable, and our lives are transient. And actually, we just obviously had the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I remember that week 20 years ago. Rosh Hashanah came exactly a week later, and I remember reading some of those things, and it was about we're like a passing shadow, and I was thinking about the shadow of those buildings over Manhattan. That shadow was gone now, and ki'avak poreach, like dust that flies up in the wind, and just thinking about the dust that was being kicked up constantly from that site. And there were so many of those phrases that were there, and then it ends with, and it's like a dream that vanishes, and then there's this line, V'atahu melech el chai v'kayam. This is a chazan, Julia, right? You're supposed to get into a major key there, and there's you are the ever living. There's something that we can rely on. When Yair Rosenblum wrote this Unetaneh Tokef for that kibbutz, he ended it at v'chachalom yauf, right? Like a dream that vanishes. He knew that you are the ever living God was not going to fly in that kibbutz, and they weren't looking for hope. I mean, we all look for hope. They weren't looking for hope at that moment. What they needed was a sense of connection to every human being and to every Jew and to every Zionist, like those 11 children of theirs that had given their lives. They needed a connection like that, and it didn't have to end with hope. So there are a lot of different dimensions to this, and I think it is fascinating that way.
So our colleague Rabbi Paula Drill is on, and just shared a really interesting comment. She wrote, "It's so interesting how we take this prayer." I'm going to paraphrase Paula, so literally, and yet we pray all kinds of things that we don't necessarily believe. So she's pointing out that when we face our mortality, we grasp for understanding there, perhaps more than other kinds of themes in our liturgy.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. The only thing is that sometimes literalness comes back to bite you. You can talk about the plague of envy or something, but when you're in an actual plague, as we are, you realize that it's a mikra no yodse midei pshuto, that you may have all sorts of drashes, but they tell you don't ever don't ever push the plain meaning aside, because at some point it's going to assert itself. And unfortunately, it has, with the fires in the West and the floods in the East and the pandemic and all of these things. It is quite literal this year.
Absolutely. I remember as a child thinking those things didn't apply to us, and every single one of them does now. So I know you want to move on. I'll just tell you the remaining two popular themes in the many questions I've received since I said I didn't have questions. One is, really still pressing about the question of theodicy and right, the kind of the significance that you've shared with us doesn't eliminate that problem in the prayer. And also there's a lot of interest in knowing, what your take is on those words, tefillah, Teshuva, tefillah, tzedakah. I don't know if you were planning to get to those things or not, but so I just wanted to.
I'm actually moving on from Unetaneh Tokef now. So that's for another time, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Okay. So if Unetaneh Tokef is a part of the Yom Kippur liturgy whose power and whose impact is maybe greater because of the communal character that Yom Kippur inherited over the centuries, I'm going to submit that something of the opposite is true of what is perhaps the signature liturgy of the day of at-one-ment, and that's the confession, the vidur. Both Ashamnu and al-chet, which is sometimes called the short confession and the long confession, they are, after all, phrased in the plural. It's Ashamnu, not Ashamti, and it's al-chet shechatanu lefanecha, not al-chet shechatati. We have sinned, we are guilty, not I am guilty, and I am beating my chest for the sins that we have committed. And this is often cited with great approval. It's a wonderful thing that when we confess, we are doing it in the plural as a community. And the two reasons for that are, I think, the following. So one is, we generally applaud the idea that each individual is taking responsibility for and taking responsibility to the community. Kol Yisrael Arevim. Every member of the Jewish people is supposed to be, in some sense, a guarantor or an underwriter for the welfare of everyone else. It's similar to the fact that we ask for communal needs and not merely individual needs in the weekday Amidah. Right? Rifa'enu, not Rifa'eni. Heal us, not heal me. And for us today, it's a reminder that our individual failings are hardly the whole picture. Particularly, thinking about some of the things that have come to our attention more vividly in the past year or two, systemic injustices that we are unwittingly or complacently complicit with in our society. In Heschel's very famous phrase, he said, in a free society, few are guilty, but all are responsible. So that's one of the reasons why we say, yeah, this is, look how smart Judaism is. Look how wonderful Judaism is. When we are confessing, we're not just going into a booth and talking about our own sins. We're confessing as a community in the plural. And there's a second reason to approve of the communal cast in the confession. And it was articulated by Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz, who lived in the 19th century in the city of Danzig. The last Mishnah in Tractate Ta'anit designated Yom Kippur as one of the two most joyous days in the Jewish calendar. That in itself is an eyebrow raiser. Yom Kippur, one of the most joyous days in the calendar. And in Lifshitz's commentary on the Mishnah, one of the most important commentaries, called Tiferet Yisrael, he wondered about the music that he knew was sung to the Ashamnu confession. So what he had to say is in the next text that I'm going to put up here. So here is Lifshitz. It seems to me that this, by which he meant the idea that Israel, having fasted and confessed, is presenting itself with pride and confidence before its creator, is also the reason for the custom among the Jews to sing Ashamnu on Yom Kippur, to sing Ashamnu on Yom Kippur. One would expect that prayer to call forth a dirge and not an upbeat song, right? It's not, think about El Malei Rachamim, that we know how to sing mournfully when we're talking about things that are sad. We don't do that with Ashamnu. So what is this about an upbeat song? And he says, yet we have here a hint that repentance has transformed sins into merits, and it's well worth singing about those merits. He was building on an idea that appears in the Talmud, that sincere confession out of love transforms sins, because sincere confession out of love, and doing this in the context of a community, means we are strengthening one another in our desire to transform ourselves. And once I am transformed, I'm no longer the person who committed that sin. I'm a different person now. And so the very fact that I have engaged in this transformation means that I've accrued some merit here and not demerit. And so even though you might think that Ashamnu would require a mournful mode of recitation, confession is actually an occasion for a victory celebration. And tellingly, I don't know if you ever thought of this, the melody that Ashkenazim use, that I just gave you a little piece of, it's essentially that melody that is used for Shirat Hayam, for the Song of the Sea. Think about it. Shira Ladonai Kigaoga, da 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 da, Ashamnu. It's like the same melody that we do when we sing the song of triumph of crossing the Red Sea, and it's not just there. I like to call that melody, and here, for those of us who are old enough to remember, I give apologies to Jackie Gleason. I call this traveling music. I don't know if you remember Jackie Gleason with his traveling music. This is traveling music because it always is used to mark a triumphant transition. It might be the transition through the sea, or from one place in the wilderness wanderings to the next, ever closer to the promised land. We do that at the end of the book of Numbers. Vayisu, Vayachanu, they camped here, they moved on. We use the same melody. Maybe it's a transition from one book of the Torah to the next. Chazak, Chazak, V'nit Chazek is also part of that same mode. Or moving from one day of creation to the next day on Simchat Torah, Vayiher, Vayivoker, etc., etc. There was evening, there was morning. All of these travels and these transformations, these transitions, were most surprisingly Ashamnu. Amazing. So Jonathan Friedman wrote about this strange phenomenon 11 years ago, and we're going to see it in our next text. I'm just going to look at just one piece of it. He first starts by rehearsing for us exactly what Ashamnu says, but let's start over here on the third line in this paragraph. Ashamnu spells out in detail how we tend to sin, to negate the promise of life in our own existence, which is a far cry from the celebratory and life-affirming words sung following the Red Sea crossing. Moreover, worshipers stand slightly bent. They beat their chests at each mention of sin, indicating that evil stems from the heart. In fact, the only obvious link between these texts is that Ashamnu is sung as a call and response between cantor and congregation, which recalls the responsive singing of Moses and the Israelites in the Exodus account. Yet while this manner of singing in Exodus emphasizes the collective nature of redemption, its use in singing Ashamnu suggests collective sinfulness. So its connection with the Shirah melody is an example of what Barbara Babcock termed symbolic inversion. And then he goes into a little bit about what did I just do there? Here we go. what symbolic inversion is. He says, when attached to the Shirah tune, this relentless list of transgressions, epitomizing human fallibility and our apparent helplessness in the face of our darkest impulses, it's overlaid with a sense of exaltation because of that melody. The music inverts the prayer from darkness to light. And the few scholars who have attempted to explain the link between Ashamnu and the Shirah see the melody as providing a sense of hope, there's that word, to worshipers seeking exoneration from sin. But in both the Exodus account and the other texts to which the melody is applied, the Shirah marks a victorious moment after the completion of a journey or task, not a longing for future release. And therefore, it can be argued that the connection between Ashamnu and the Shirah melody is based on the notion that confession itself is a triumphant act. It's not the future that we are going to try to build for ourselves after the confession. It's the very possibility of confessing. And engaging in that moment is itself a transformation, itself a triumph. So Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik of blessed memory added to this and gave a clear endorsement of the communal aspect of confession. You see, I'm focusing on this because, as I told you, I'm going to come back right afterwards and say, but the communal notion of this is not unproblematic, but wait for that. Right now, we're still talking about how great it is. He talked about this communal aspect of confession as having a special and even a higher efficacy than individual confession and contrition. And so our next text is going to come from the collection of his teachings on repentance, on Teshuva. Here's what he wrote. The individual cannot demand acquittal. As he stands before God as an individual, he's dominated by the conviction that he's sinned, and he knows that sin entails punishment. Individual confession can lead to only one conclusion: justification of the sentence. Communal confession, Ashamnu, which is made by the prayer leader in the repetition of the Amidah, is based on completely different assumptions. How is it introduced? It's introduced with we are your people, you are our God. We are your children, you are our parent. We are your beloved, you are our lover. And only afterwards comes the prayer, Ashamnu Bagadnu. Only after confirmation of the love and close relationship prevailing between the flock and the shepherd, etc., only then do we arrive at the stage of communal recognition of sin expressed in the short confession of we have sinned. What's the difference? The difference between individual and communal confession, says Soloveitchik, is tremendous. When the individual confesses, he does so from a state of insecurity, depression, despair in the wake of sin. In contrast, Knesset Yisrael, the totality of the community of Israel, confesses out of a sense of confidence and even rejoicing, because it does so in the presence of a loyal ally before its most beloved one. And then he says, in fact, in certain Jewish communities, I myself heard this in Germany, he says, it is customary for the whole congregation to sing the Al-Chet confession, not just Ashamnu, in heartwarming melodies. In this scheme, you see, the individual, as an individual, cannot be assured of forgiveness unless and until the heart is broken and true inner repentance is achieved and punishment is endured. As a member of the Jewish people, he says, the very act of communal confession, of being willing to identify with the Jewish people as a whole and their covenant with God, that assures one of complete reconciliation with God. Because as the prelude to the communal confession put it, Ki anu amecha v'ata Eloheinu, we are your people, you are our God, eternally, come what may. And all one has to do, and this is what Soloveitchik says, all one has to do is identify with that people of the eternal covenant, and you are part of Israel's solidarity with its God, and therefore the traveling music of triumph. So all of this is in praise of the communal plural confession. But now I'm going to tell you that I think it's not entirely unproblematic. And I want to raise two important issues with it. So first, for all of the healthy prompting of communal responsibility, I quoted Heschel, in a free society, few are guilty, all are responsible. All of that is great. But there's actually a serious danger that lurks in the plural confession of we have sinned. And I'm going to make this problem very vivid. Did you know that together, Derek Jeter and I have 3,465 major league hits? The statement is unassailably true. But you see, all of those hits are his. Now, in the same way that hiding behind the plural can allow us to claim credit for things we had no part in. How many times have we said, we built this, we built that, right? We can hide behind the plural to claim credit. It can also allow us to evade responsibility for those things that we actually do have a part in. By sticking to the plural, it's the other side of the coin. We've sinned. We are guilty. That allows us to say, yes, we have, and it's because of the other guy. One thing, by the way, that rabbinic practitioners learn is that when you receive the nice compliment, good sermon, Rabbi, you know what that really means. What that means is, I, of course, already agreed with everything you said, but it was really important for that benighted person in the next row to have heard that. So that's one problem with the plural confession. It's the evasion of responsibility. And then there's a second issue that we shouldn't avoid. Soloveitchik's beautiful and inspiring idea that we are part of an eternal covenant, and because of that, we can expect and even demand reconciliation and renewal with God. It's beautiful. It's inspiring. It gives us hope. But this is apparently what's known in Jewish thought as the Davidic covenant. That is, the essential and unconditional commitment that God made to David. It's no secret that David was not a spotless individual, far from it. But David had God's eternal promise that no matter what he did, he might get wrapped on the knuckles for it, but no, that covenant was never going to be abrogated. No matter what he or any of his descendants might do, there might be temporary consequences, but never, ever an abrogation of the pact. You should contrast this with the covenant at Sinai, which we have just read about in the last couple of weeks in the Torah. And we're reminded in the reading each year, just around the time of Slichot, that violating the covenant at Sinai egregiously and repeatedly will bring with it an end to the relationship. Back to Egypt with you, in slave ships that will be unable to find buyers on the other end. That's how that admonition ends in the book of Deuteronomy. So, I love the upbeat nature of Yom Kippur. I love that major key singing of Hashamnu. I love it as much as anyone does. But we should also ask ourselves, which is more civilizing? A covenant that forces us to confront our individual failings and their expected consequences? Or a covenant that tells us that there's a reliable relationship with our Creator no matter what? Which is more civilizing? And this question is what leads me to a point having what I would say is very current ramifications, and which is, I believe, a real concern. Soloveitchik's beautiful depiction of the certainty we can have that connection with the Jewish people gives us participation in an unconditional relationship with God. That was essential. That was inspiring, necessary, essential when the communal entity of Israel had no real power of action, had no power of dispensing justice, rather justice or more often injustice was done to it and not by it. But that's no longer the case. And I think we should consider that in a time of Jewish statehood and Jewish power over others, and in a time of Jewish prosperity and influence, even in the diaspora, There is justifiable cause for worry if the crucial soul-searching confession and need for repentance for each individual is not carried out, and only then extended to the people and the nation as well. There is one last text that I have for you. We're not going to read it together. It's just more of a gift for you for Yom Kippur, because in this teaching, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav turns completely on its head the usual notion of Teshuva. Rather than being something like the search for chametz before Pesach, you know what the search for chametz is? We search for all the blemishes. We search for all the things that we have to root out. So Teshuva we usually think of as we search for the blemishes in our character and we take steps to eradicate them. Nachman tells us instead that we're supposed to be searching for the many points of goodness that exist within every human being. And the telling thing about this is the beautiful bridge that this idea builds between the community and the individual in Teshuva, because Reb Nachman believes that this process begins with an application to those with whom we share our community. That is, your tendency is to try to judge others. He says, don't do that. Find the points of goodness in others so that your judgment of them is tempered with compassion and love. Now that you know how to do this, now you'll know how to do it for yourself, on yourself. And in the process, by finding all the good things inside you, you will produce what he calls a signature melody out of those points of goodness, almost as if they were points that were being plotted on a musical staff. It becomes your signature nigun. And that will overshadow and overcome all of the failings over which you thought you had to obsess in a depressing scrutiny. So attention to the community in Yom Kippur thus becomes a key to learning how to cleanse one's individual soul as well, which I think is a gorgeous synthesis. And I commend it to you, and I hope you will spend a little time savoring it and meditating on it before Yom Kippur in a few days. And now we have, I think, about 7 or 8 minutes left to take whatever questions there might remain.
Okay. All right, so folks, feel free to send me your questions. I just wanted to ask you that, so the way that Ashamnu melody is sung in a lot of places has always just struck me as so incongruous. Where I grew up, and Dr. Saul Wax was my high holiday cantor. I was very blessed to grow up with him in that role. He sang it in a very kind of slow, tender way, right? Which it has, if you do it that way, it has almost a lullaby quality to it, which is how I lead it now, which I think is consistent sort of with the Soloveitchik view, that it's sort of comforting us in knowing that we have God's forgiveness. So I always thought of that as very positive, and you're putting it out as as lovely, and also a real challenge for us to assume that we have God's forgiveness. And as much as we want to talk about collective responsibility, right? Like once everyone's responsible, then no one's responsible. Okay.
Yeah. Amen. All true.
Okay. All right. So one person is asking if you can share thoughts with us about. We've been talking about kind of Jewish collective responsibility and confessing as a Jewish people. And this person is asking about what about the human community, and how particularistic do you think these texts and ideas that you're sharing with us are?
Well, look, there are texts where, I guess I'm gonna refer to the old Levy's Jewish Rye commercial. What do you have to be Jewish to love? They claimed you didn't have to be Jewish to love Levy's Jewish Rye. You don't have to be Jewish to love Ashamnu. You don't have to be Jewish to love Al-Chet. By the way, the Al-Chet liturgy, the litany in the Al-Chet, as in Ashamnu, doesn't make any reference to particularistic Jewish things. It doesn't talk about the sin we committed by violating Shabbat. They essentially are all ben adam l'chaveiro, almost entirely. Few here and there, but even those are not particularistically Jewish. So already the liturgy is signaling a kind of universalism. Now, Jews were not inclined to think universalistically through much of their history for good reason, but there is good reason for us to think in those ways today, because look, we can't simply say that I'm gonna use a little bit of a not exactly a vulgar, but vulgar in the true sense of the word vulgar. We can't say the Goyim are responsible for climate change. We're as responsible as they are. We are part of humanity, more so than ever before. And that's what I meant at the end, in talking about the fact that when Jews were powerless, it was great to talk about God will always be with us. But when we actually have power and we can do things that can ruin other people's lives and be harmful to the planet and all of these things, I don't know if it's the greatest thing to say God will love us no matter what, right? So I do think that there is a very good reason to think much more broadly and expansively about this liturgy, that it's linking us to the human condition just as much as it's linking us to the Jews of all ages who have gathered to recite this liturgy.
So just in our last minute, can I put you on the spot? How do you, when you're going to be saying this in a couple of days, which of these lenses do you experience it through? Like when you're actually praying these confessions, and this year in particular.
It's both a wave and a particle, right? I mean, it's both. It is both. And the burden of my teaching today, I think, was really to make a bit of a corrective. Like for those for whom the individual terrifying implications of Unetaneh Tokef are what Martha experienced, it's worth correcting that with an understanding of what the connections to humanity can do in terms of solidarity for Unetaneh Tokef. And conversely, for those who understandably and with justification applaud a kind of a communal expression of responsibility in the confession, we have to correct that some and remember that without individual responsibility, we are not going to be civilized in the end. So I think we have to find room for both of them. What a perfect and beautiful crystallization of your whole shiur. Connecting to the fear of mortality in a way that we're not alone, but also making sure that we are looking at ourselves individually when it comes to our misdeeds, both communally and individually. Thank you so much for sharing these readings. It's one of the most amazing things about our tradition. Every year, you can come back to the same words and through inspiration, like you've shared with us today, really read and hear and experience them differently. So thank you so much for teaching us today. You're welcome. And don't forget to dwell a little bit with the Bratslaver text.
Thank you for that reminder. And a few people also asked for the Yair Rosenblum recording, and if you just go ahead and Google Yair Rosenblum Unetaneh Tokef, it will come right up. I know I'm going to do that as soon as we end this meeting. Thank you everyone for coming. Wish everyone individually and collectively a year of health and success and healing. And Gemar Chatima Tova, and we will hopefully see you in a few weeks on the flip side of these Chagim for a new fall series of learning. Thank you again, Rabbi Tucker. Take care, everyone.
Gemar Chatima Tova to everyone.